Well, this morning we are going to start on a new sermon series or grouping of sorts. We are going to be going through a good number of the parables of Jesus. We won't be doing all of them because in the past year I have done some of them per the lectionary and so on. But we will, for the next good number of weeks, be going through an explanation of many of Jesus' parables, which of course is important because parables were one of the primary ways that Jesus taught. And so this morning we are going to begin this series with Matthew chapter 13, verses 1 through 9, and that's what I'll read at the top. And then we will also read verses 18 through 23 as well. That same day, Jesus went out of the house and sat beside the sea. Such great crowds gathered around him that he got into a boat and sat there while the whole crowd stood on the beach. And he told them many things in parables, saying, "Listen, a sower went out to sow. And as he sowed, some seeds fell on the path, and the birds came and ate them up. Other seeds fell on rocky ground, where they did not have much soil, and they sprang up quickly, since they had no depth of soil. But when the sun rose, they were scorched, and since they had no root, they withered away. Other seeds fell among thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked them. Other seeds fell on good soil and brought forth grain, some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. Let anyone with ears listen." Well, life is full of expectations and outcomes. And sometimes we have high expectations, and the outcomes meet those high expectations. Other times we have low expectations, and the outcome surpasses our expectations. And I imagine we all love it when the outcome meets our high expectations or exceeds our low expectations. Those are enjoyable experiences. But of course, on the other hand, there are times when we have low expectations and the outcome meets our low expectations. Or perhaps worst of all, we have high expectations and the outcome fails to meet those expectations. Now, when this last one happens, we of course experience disappointment or heartache, or even, in the worst of cases, a sense of hopelessness. I'm quite sure none of us enjoy outcomes that fail to live up to our expectations. And unfortunately, if this occurs too often, we might even stop having high expectations altogether and become accustomed to simply having very low expectations in life so we do not face perpetual disappointment. Well, I apologize for double dipping on an illustration this morning because I referenced it in the newsletter that went out last week. But an example of an outcome not meeting my personal expectations occurred about 6 years ago when Elizabeth and I decided to run in a half marathon. She was able to convince me to participate by booking a race in an exciting setting that I was sure to enjoy. So that's how I got roped into it. And so in the months leading up to the race, as I was diligently training and trying to get my body to do something it had never done before, I began to have certain images in my head of what this event was going to be like. I mean, I had no doubt it was going to be tough, but the promise of running in the midst of festivities and fun, and the promise of an epic celebration for all the participants after the race, all this led me to have rather high expectations leading up to the event. But the experience did not live up to my expectations. The race took place late at night in Florida, and I had unrealistic expectations about what the weather was going to be like. I wasn't expecting it to be raining and in the low 50s. So I was not prepared to be freezing cold in Florida while running a race. And I was not prepared to have to wait outside amongst thousands of people in the rain with a limited number of porta potties for 3 hours or more before I even started the race. You see, we were in the last group to begin running because we hadn't submitted a time, because I'd never done this before. And even though I had done my training, I hadn't been prepared for the adrenaline to kick in when I started running, and so I started out way too fast, and I had to walk for 2 miles in the middle of the race. And by the time we were finished, I was too tired and wet and miserable to stick around and enjoy this epic celebration. And so when the race was over, we just left, went home, and went to bed. The outcome did not match my expectations. In our scripture lesson for today, Jesus presents us with a parable which is in part about expectations and outcomes. And so this morning we will explore this parable of the 4 soils and the sower and examine what this story teaches us about expectations and outcomes. So to begin with, let's try and paint the picture a bit, since farming looks a little bit different in Iowa in 2020 than it did when Jesus presented the parable originally. So there were 2 ways of sowing seeds in ancient Palestine. In the first, a sower would walk up and down the fields, scattering seeds as they went. Now, obviously, some seed would land where the sower intended, other seed would be blown off course or fall off course. The other way to sow was to put a sack of seed on the back of a donkey and tear a hole in the corner of the sack and walk the animal up and down the field, dispersing the seed. In this case, again, some seed would land where the sower intended, while other seed would not. So regardless of which method the farmer used, some seed would land on good soil and some would not. Now, Jesus includes 4 types of soil or ground on which the seed might land. First, Jesus says some seeds fell on the path and the birds quickly came and ate them up. In ancient Palestine, the fields were laid in long, narrow strips with a path in between the strips of field. And these paths were typically used by many people. They were well traversed. And so it was almost inevitable, given the proximity, that some of the seed would end up on these paths. And on these paths, the earth was far too hard and packed down for a seed to take root. And so if seed landed there, birds would come down and snatch it up right away. Second, Jesus says, other seeds fell on rocky ground where they did not have much soil, and they sprang up quickly since they had no depth of soil. But when the sun rose, they were scorched, and since they had no root, they withered away. Now, in Palestine, we might have an image in our head of soil with rocks in it. That's not exactly what Jesus is getting at here. In Palestine, it's common for there to be a thin piece of earth on top of a shelf of limestone rock. Okay? So in some cases, there might only be a few inches of topsoil sitting on top of an impenetrable shelf of limestone. And so if a seed fell on that soil, it would grow quickly enough. However, the roots would only go down a short depth before reaching that limestone. And since they couldn't go any deeper than that, when the sun would come out, the sun would kill the plant. Third, Jesus says other seeds fell among thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked them. So we might think here about when a farmer or a gardener goes out and tills up the earth before planting. It probably looks like the ideal soil for a crop, but sometimes hidden within the tilled up earth might be the roots of any number of weeds or thorns, just waiting to spring up again. And often these weeds can grow with speed and strength that favored plants cannot. And so the weeds and thorns kill the plants that the sower intended to grow in the first place. Fourth and finally, other seeds fell on good soil and brought forth grain, some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. So this is the soil that is deep, fertile, and free, or mostly free, from weeds and thorns. It is the good soil that the seed is able to easily penetrate, find nourishment, not compete for resources, and therefore produce an abundant crop. This is the soil the farmer is sowing seeds for. This is the intended target. Now, unlike with most of the parables that Jesus tells, Matthew includes Jesus' explanation of this particular parable, as he does for the one that we'll talk about next week. Just following the text we read this morning, Jesus explains to his disciples what the parable means. And so we are spared much of the guesswork involved in parsing the parable. But Jesus essentially explains that God sows the seeds of the gospel all over the place. But the condition of a person's heart, their soil, determines the outcome. And so let's take a look at Jesus' explanation. Hear the parable of the sower. When anyone hears the word of the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what was sown in the heart. This is what was sown on the path. Now, in this case, some people have hearts that are simply too hard for the love of God to grow in. Now, the heart may be hardened by hatred. The heart may be hardened by an unwillingness to surrender to God and change. The heart may be hardened by an abundance of terrible life experiences. Or the heart may be hardened by just a simple refusal to believe in God altogether. But regardless, Jesus says, such a heart, upon hearing the gospel, is unable to understand or accept it. Second, Jesus says, as for what was sown on rocky ground, this is the one who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy. Yet such a person has no root, but endures only for a little while. And when trouble or persecution arises on account of the word, that person immediately falls away. Now, we might think here of such hearts as those who are willing to turn to God for a quick fix or for hope during a time of distress, but are unwilling to commit to discipleship for the long haul. So we might think, for example, of what happened after 9/11, right? Church attendance ballooned for a very short period of time and then started back down again. The heart with no root is the heart that is unwilling to live obediently and sacrificially, and therefore will quickly turn away if something better or easier comes along. Now, kind of as a side note, I do believe altar calls and revivals have their place, but far too often they lead to seed being sown on rocky ground, right? People have an exciting emotional experience, but that's about it. As soon as that fades, so does their faith. Third, as for what was sown among thorns, this is the one who hears the word, but the cares of the world and the lure of wealth choke the word, and it yields nothing. Now, we might think of this soil in terms of the dangerous realities of modern American life. As life becomes increasingly fast-paced and busy, and as we feel increasingly pressured to work more hours, to make more money, to afford the lifestyle we think is going to make us happy, the time and energy we have left to invest in prayer and scripture and church become choked out. And if we are not committed and on guard against the abundance of competing distractions, the faith God planted within us could very easily be choked out. Fourth and finally, but as for what was sown on good soil, this is the one who hears the word and understands it, and who indeed bears fruit and yields, in one case 100-fold, in another 60, and in another 30. So the good soil, the good heart, does not lack what the others do. The good heart is open and fertile rather than hardened and closed. The good heart is committed and invested in following Christ for the long haul, not just when it's convenient and easy. The good heart is willing to obediently make time to invest in faith and put it into practice, so that the love of God transforms not only them, but those around them. They produce fruit. So such are the characteristics of the good soil. So given the explanation, we may understand or could understand this parable as a challenge of sorts for hearers of the word. Right? And the parable does cause anyone who reads it to ask themselves, okay, what kind of soil am I? But as I said, this parable is also about expectations and outcomes. You see, the parable is not only aimed at those who hear the gospel, but also at those who preach it and live it. And I'm not talking about preaching just in what I'm doing here from this, I was going to say pulpit, but music stand, but preaching in the sense that all of us who call Jesus Lord are called to give witness to his lordship. And in that sense, all of us are called to be sowers. Through the parable, Jesus alerts us to the reality that there is good soil out there. God has prepared hearts to receive his gospel. Now, it might not seem like it at times, right? It might not seem like it right now in our angry, divided culture. It might seem like nobody is interested in the gospel or the church anymore. It might seem like everybody is hostile toward Jesus and towards those who call him Lord. And Scripture warns us about that as well. But through the parable, Jesus assures us, hey, there is fertile soil out there. The harvest is guaranteed. And so for us who are Christians reading the parable, the question becomes, are we going to be faithful to sow it? Because how does God typically sow the word? Through us, right? Through those who believe in Jesus. That's what we are called to do. Now, perhaps because we have encountered shallow or rocky or thorny soil in the past, we have become hesitant, if not reluctant, to allow God to use us to sow the seed. And what's more, our culture indeed does seem to be becoming much less tolerant, if not flat out antagonistic, toward the gospel. But I want us to keep a couple of things in mind here. Okay? First, we need to remember that none of us are privy to what type of soil any other human being actually is. Right? We are transgressing Jesus' command not to judge if we assume any particular person is shallow, rocky, or thorny soil, and therefore we just refuse to sow to them. I mean, what if whoever sowed the seed in us hadn't done so because they assumed we were shallow, rocky, or thorny? And I can tell you, earlier in my life, I was probably all three of those things. And some of the greatest testimonies of life-changing faith come from those who, from all outward appearances, were unlikely to yield any fruit whatsoever. And so our responsibility is to sow, and to sow well. And we have to remember, no farmer expects every seed he or she sows to bear fruit. If they do, their expectations are probably unrealistic, right? Jesus tells us very explicitly there are 4 types of soils, and only one of them is good. But when it comes down to it, really, this parable is one of hope. Our expectation ought to be that God, the sower, is alive and well, and is sowing actively and broadly, and that he has prepared hearts to receive the word, and that he is looking to us, his church, to participate in that process. And frankly, we have to practice sowing in order to have the proper expectations, right? I mean, if I haven't shared my faith in 10 or 15 years, because the one time I did, I encountered thorny soil, I'm not going to have the kind of expectations I ought to have. In order to have the proper expectations, I have to continue sowing. Now, I want to briefly come back to my marathon analogy. After that first experience, in which the outcome absolutely did not live up to my expectations, I had no intention of ever trying it again. But last year, as most of you know, something inside me decided, okay, you need to try this again. And when I decided that, I decided I would enter into it with better preparation and more realistic expectations. And so to begin with, I made sure to participate in a 10K several months ahead of time so I could get an official time submitted. And this way, I didn't have to be in the last group of the half marathon. So this way, I didn't have to wait nearly as long amongst the throngs of people before actually beginning the race. And I also, having experienced the event 5 years prior, knew that the excitement and joy of my surroundings would not be enough to carry me through. And so I had much more consistent training leading up to the race. And I had invested in a watch that helped me easily keep track of my pace so I didn't start out going way too fast and crash and burn at mile 8. Because of all these preparations, I felt much more confident going into the race. And so my expectations were still quite high, but at the same time, they were much more grounded because I knew what I was getting into. And wouldn't you know it, the second time around, the outcome aligned much more closely with my expectations. I mean, sure, I hadn't planned on all but 2 of my toenails filling up with blood blisters by mile 10. But at the end of the race, after I made sure, I wasn't going to pass out or throw up, I was actually able to enjoy that post-race celebration that I had missed out on years before. And so I socialized with other runners, and I stood in line to get pictures with characters and so on. And if I ever do it again, and that is a very big if, chances are the outcome will match my expectations to an even greater extent. we have to practice sowing. If we do not sow, the outcome is guaranteed, right? Nothing will happen, at least not through us. But the more we sow, the more our expectations will align with the reality that there are 4 possible results. Is all of it going to land on fertile ground? No. But some of it will. And that ought to be our primary expectation. That God has prepared the hearts of some to receive the gospel through me. And so as Christians, when we read this parable, the question becomes, am I willing to help sow the seed? I hope our answer this morning is a resounding yes.